Hi everyone. So I decided that for this lecture on assessment, I would record it for you because it's a little longer and I'm not sure we could get through all of it in class. And part of it is because it's completely my fault. I get a little carried away on this topic. I get carried away on a lot of topics, don't I? But I really get carried away on assessment because I did my dissertation on assessment in schools or some aspects of it. So I recorded it because it's a little bit longer. This will allow you to watch it in chunks if you get tired of watching or hearing me talk. Um, and you can watch it during the week whenever you want. I'll explain that in class. I'll give you some things to do along with it that you can do by the end of the week. So, we are living in a testing culture. Under NCLB, which some of you may have heard of before, the No Child Left Behind Act that was passed in 2001, it was actually a reauthorization of ESEA, which is an earlier act from the 1960s. NCLB instituted even higher control at the federal government level on school performance. And so what happened was there was a publication that came out called A Nation at Risk that talked about how our students were just scoring really low. Their achievement was low compared to the rest of developing countries. So our federal government was concerned, and they decided we're going to intervene and we're going to figure out a way to bring up our student performance because these are the future of our country, right? Well, the problem was that the main way that they decided to do that was by creating tests and testing students across the nation to evaluate their performance. Well, we know that not everybody has the same ability to perform well on a test. And so relying on one test, many people have questioned as to whether that was a good choice. But this resulted in a prioritization of preparation for high stakes tests. Because there was so much pressure on schools for their students to perform well, then pressure was put on teachers to prepare their students for these tests. So then what happens is, what do you think the teachers are teaching in their classroom? They're teaching the content of what was on those tests. So many argue that it narrowed the curriculum because no longer do teachers have the same kind of creativity, ability to be creative in the classroom because they're having to focus on the standards and the items that they know are going to appear on these tests. And you've read a little bit about high stakes tests now that you've done the Moodle assignment on assessment. So you've had an introduction to some of the benefits and drawbacks. So we will go over those a little bit more, but I know you're slightly familiar at least. So a lot of problems were recognized with NCLB with this federal government control. And so during the Obama administration, they came up with a different plan and passed an act called the Every Student Succeeds Act, which essentially, you can see a number of points here, but the most important thing is that the Every Student Succeeds Act gave a lot of the control back to the states so that things weren't so highly regulated by the government. So the states were allowed, there was still a really strong focus on underperforming schools, bringing up grades for those who were considered to be lower socioeconomic and disadvantaged and performing at low levels. But states had the responsibility for holding their schools accountable. States were able to decide when the tests would happen. They also were able to decide what tests would be given, and they were also able to determine what the scoring targets would be. The federal government still regulates this to some extent because the schools have to report to the federal government and tell them what their plan is for accountability. The federal government then might give them some feedback and then it would be approved. So once ESSA was passed, it didn't truly go into effect until around 2017 to 2018, that school year. And a lot of states are still kind of ironing out the kinks and figuring out what accountability looks like in their states. But key here is that the testing culture still ensues. It's still present regardless of which act you are under. When you look at international data, which is actually the first thing that concerned officials in our country, was the performance of students in our country relative to others. But when you look at these international data, you see that the countries where the students are scoring the highest are the countries where they make the teaching profession more selective and more prestigious, which means that teachers are actually looked upon on almost an equal level to how the culture would view doctors and lawyers. Their training is extensive. You have to have really high grades to get into teacher training schools, and they're also compensated very well and highly respected in those cultures. Also, another piece of data that we see in the countries where students perform well is all children are enrolled in high quality preschools. And we know that that doesn't occur here. There is some economic lack of equality as to who gets to go to preschool and who gets to do that for free. And it is different across states how that is handled as well. But we know that all students in our country do not get free access to high quality preschool. They provide more resources to the children who are neediest in those countries, and they establish a culture in the school that really focuses on constant improvement. Also, there are rigorous standards and high expectations of all of the students. So these are the things that we are seeing consistently leading to higher student performance. So another term you may have heard before is the Common Core. So what happened, to keep telling the story of testing in our nation, is that officials started noticing that there was discrepancy across states in how students were scoring. So in some states, students were scoring really well on their tests, and in others they were not. And they didn't think that that was necessarily due to overall ability level in one state compared to the other. What they determined was that this is probably because they're using different tests and they're using different standards. So students are learning different things. So the decision was made then to come up with what's called the Common Core, a common set of standards that could be used in every state. Now, these have been developed. I will say, I don't think I have this on the slide, there were virtually no teachers on the committee that came up with the Common Core standards, and there were a lot of policymakers who hadn't ever been in a classroom, but that's a separate issue that I have. Not every state has adopted the Common Core, but many have, and the Common Core standards include not only the standards themselves, but also some guidelines as to how to teach those standards, and then the accountability tests as a result are aligned to those Common Core standards. Now, a lot of questions have been asked. Has this been a positive thing because multiple states are using the same core standards? Does this foster collaboration amongst states and amongst educators so they can work together more closely toward this common good and improvement? Or does it foster competition? Because now we can look at states in comparison to one another and say this state is doing great and that state has some real issues. And also it's an issue that not all of the states have signed on to this. So high stakes testing and its issues. So I mentioned before that the assessment will drive the curriculum. So this means that the curriculum may be narrowed. So as a result, this decreases the opportunities that teachers have to be creative and to come up with authentic learning experiences that are unique to the needs and interests of those students. Instead, they don't have a chance to respond to what their students want to learn or what they feel is like their expertise to teach. They have to follow what these standards dictate, not only in what they teach, but sometimes even how they teach it. The poorer students are also at greater risk because they don't receive equal educational opportunities, but they're still being evaluated by the same exact test. And many argue that these may perpetuate achievement gaps. Students who start out scoring low, if they continue along a path where they are tested annually, this may turn into a label where they just assume that I'm stupid, I don't score well on tests, and they allow this to shape them, to shape their own identity, and it perpetuates their own achievement and also then perpetuates these gaps between various groups and how they score. Now, also as an aside, we are seeing now that fortunately the gap between the white majority and other racial groups has narrowed, so they're scoring more closely. There has been some effort in making sure that we're providing more equal opportunities to learning to minority groups, but we're seeing a widening gap related to socioeconomic status, which tells me that the poorer schools are still not being resourced equally with those in more affluent areas. So that's where we really need to focus our efforts. If you're somebody in education policy, for example, the system is failing. So As a result of these tests, the educators are really focusing on bringing all students to the standard. And what this also does is that we see that a lot of teachers end up focusing very strongly on the students who are almost at standard. They're almost scoring where they need to be. So the teachers know they have the greatest chance of raising their test scores if they can focus on them, the students that are kind of in the middle. Whereas the weakest students, sometimes they give up on them. And the advanced students lose out too because they're spending so much time focusing on the students that are just a little bit away from meeting the standard, that the advanced students, they think, oh, well, we know they're going to meet the standard, so we don't need to spend as much time working on these things with them. So it doesn't really allow for as much individualized and differentiated instruction. In addition, a lot of research studies have shown that high test scores actually don't correlate with more learning happening in the classroom. It increases anxiety for teachers and for students, especially when teachers are evaluated based on how well their students are doing on these tests, and we'll talk about that a little later. Tests can be flawed. Tests are not perfect. We won't get into the details of validity and reliability in testing, but there are a number of statisticians who their entire profession is looking at these tests and figuring out, are these tests really measuring what we say they're measuring? And will students who come from a certain background be disadvantaged and they'll score in a certain way and it doesn't really represent what they know? So it's impossible for one test to really capture everything, yet we're placing so much weight on that one test. And then there's this idea of the hidden curriculum and cultural knowledge. Sometimes tests can include certain cultural pieces in them that if a student doesn't understand the cultural context of a question, even though they know the discipline that it's evaluating, they may not be able to answer that question appropriately. So then it's not really measuring the right thing. Now, I say all of this, and tests aren't all bad. There are reasons to use tests. We do need to know how our students are doing, and we do need to know the areas where we see weaknesses so that we can put resources into those areas. But we also have to be aware of some of these issues and approach some sort of balance. And you only have control over your own classroom. So I love this cartoon. It really illustrates one of the issues with tests. You can see he says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And this is a lot of how our education system is, right? There are some students who just haven't really been created as individuals who are good in that particular testing environment. Maybe they perform in other areas. Or there are some students who haven't been provided with an equal level of resources. Maybe they grew up with no books in their home, or they are not well nourished, or they have other issues related to poverty. There could be a number of things, but yet we still expect them to take the very same test and to perform in the very same way. And it's not really accounting for individual differences. So as I mentioned, there has been a practice in some states to evaluate teachers by the students' test scores, and this can be problematic. Some districts have used these to judge how effective the teachers are. And test scores have been used to determine even teachers' salary increases and decreases at times. Now, if I can try to sum this up quickly, one of the issues here is that we know that the teacher plays a role for sure in students' academic performance, but there are a slew of other variables too, right? Like, what if some of that teacher's students are having a really difficult year that year because one of their family members passed away, or they have a family member who went to jail, or maybe they have parents who are working multiple jobs. And so the tests are reflecting what is going on in the students' lives. The teacher did everything they could, but they are still struggling academically. So we can't place all of the weight on the teacher, but this is what has happened in some cases. Since this practice started, a lot of researchers contested this and said that it's not fair to judge teachers on such a high level, to have such high stakes for teachers like their pay placed on these tests, because we really can't be certain how much of a role the teacher played in each individual student's performance. And as a result, what many districts have done including the entire state of California. And I have a link at the bottom of this slide if you're interested in looking at it. But what many districts and states have done is that these test scores can be a component of the teacher evaluation process, but not the entirety. So in California, there are 6 different teaching performance standards on which teachers are evaluated. This is one thing that administrators look at, but they look at it as an entire package. So they would look at the test scores, but they're also looking at a number of other things that speak to how that teacher is doing. So a teacher is very unlikely to be dismissed solely on the basis of students' test scores. So there are alternatives to using high-stakes tests. As I mentioned, what is really important is having some sort of balance here. So I would recommend that in your classroom, the things that you do have control over, and I would recommend on a larger scale if we could, but to have multiple assessment measures, make sure that you're not only using things like multiple choice quizzes in your class, which I'm sure you wouldn't do in an elementary context, but we need to look at many different pieces of evidence in order to evaluate how well a student is doing and what assistance they need, because we know that some people don't take tests well. And, on top of that, what if a student just has a bad day on the day of the test? Like on that particular day, they didn't get any sleep the night before. Well, that's going to affect their test score as well. So to place so much on one test is dangerous. So I recommend using multiple measures, multiple pieces of evidence in order to make any sort of judgment about how a student is doing or what improvement they've made. And there are a number of researchers and even education policymakers who are trying to push these ideas and try to make tests be a little bit more authentic. So measures of deep learning. So instead of just multiple choice options, they're trying to create items that have students do more real problem solving so we can see them apply the learning rather than just circle bubbles in order to demonstrate their factual knowledge. But doing those things is always more expensive because it's easy and cheap to grade a multiple choice test. You just run the Scantron through a machine. So that's why these things end up happening in this way. But if you look at this example below, it illustrates this. I mean, imagine that a tennis player loses 5 matches in a row. The coach is not going to address this by giving her a multiple choice test on technique. Instead, they're going to engage in authentic activities to identify, assess the weaknesses, help her improve. So the coach would get out there, they would actually do the activity together. She would get feedback along the way. You're doing this well, this needs to improve. But unfortunately, that's not the environment that we often have in a classroom. Somebody does poorly on a multiple choice test and you just keep giving them that same content in that same way, it's probably not going to make much of a difference. So one of the key things, and probably the key thing that I really want you to understand about assessment, because it applies more to your own classroom, the things I've covered so far are important to understand because it influences the environment in which you teach. But unfortunately, you probably won't be able to have a huge influence on what sort of testing culture you're teaching in. But what you can influence is the way that assessment is used in your own classroom. And so we can think of assessment as being divided into 2 different types, and those are summative and formative. A summative assessment typically happens after learning, so at the end of a learning unit. The use of a summative assessment is usually to prove that the student has learned something. Now, if you look over on the other side, instead, a formative assessment happens during the learning. So as the students are going through learning activities, using some sort of strategy to get information about what are they understanding right now and what do they not get. The purpose of this kind of assessment is actually to make the learning better, to improve it. Now going back over to summative, it measures the learning, whereas formative tries to grow learning. Summative assessment is done to the learners. We are going to give you this test. Whereas formative assessment is done with learners. I'm going to come sit beside you and ask you some questions while you're working on this assignment so I can get an idea of how you're doing and see what sort of support I need to provide you with so you can do better. just that dialogue could be considered some type of formative assessment. And sometimes we do them in more formal ways. Even a worksheet you consider a formative assessment, a low stakes worksheet that a student completes. You look at it immediately after and you decide, you know what, my kids are not getting this. I need to do something different tomorrow. Summative assessment is focused on some sort of outcome. What is the outcome of the learning? Whereas a process focus formative assessment has a process focus because we're really focused on what does the learning process look like and how can we improve that learning process. So what does this look like in the classroom? We see over on the left, kind of the beginning, is that you would make sure you're communicating with your students what are the learning objectives. So my objectives for this particular learning activity is that by the end of it, you will be able to multiply 2-digit numbers with 80% accuracy. You don't have to have that 80% accuracy would be more for you. They wouldn't understand that, probably, the little ones. But my goal is that you can multiply 2-digit numbers. And then what happens is during the instruction, you're modeling, you're demonstrating, you're giving them activities, you're using quality dialogue in the classroom, you're talking with them, you're getting information. When you see that they are having difficulty with something, you give feedback to them, which means you tell them what they're doing well, what they need to improve, where their mistakes are. They're giving feedback to you because they're telling you, like, hey, I kind of get it, but I'm still struggling once I get to this step. So you have this two-way feedback. And through that whole process, you're trying to move everyone further toward that learning objective of multiplying two-digit numbers. So we have this integrative process of formative assessment that's ongoing throughout that unit on multiplication. And then when you get to the end of that and you feel like the students are ready, you use some type of summative assessment. So there's nothing wrong with summative assessment. There are purposes to it, but you need to pair that with these formative assessment processes because that's how we know where students need help, and that's how students know, because it's so important that students understand that too. They need to be able to articulate what they're getting and what they're not getting. That's a really important life skill that you can teach them, the ability to communicate their own understanding and their own areas of lower understanding. So in this process, I mentioned already, is that role of feedback. And I think feedback is probably the most important component of a formative assessment process. There are a number of researchers who have written about feedback, and I will say when I started doing research for my PhD, which is now a number of years ago, I planned on doing it on formative assessment as a whole. And as I observed in classrooms, I discovered it was this one thing, this feedback, that was the most important. And so I focused almost solely on that. So feedback is that information that delineates the gap or explains, here's what the gap is between where you are now and the learning goal. So we need to understand, what is that gap? Where is the student and how far are they from where they need to go? And what needs to happen in order for them to progress more toward that learning goal. So that formative feedback, the things we say to them and the things we learn from the students about how they're doing, that's what helps the student move forward toward the learning goal. So a little more about feedback. It really is the core of assessment for learning, not just assessment of learning. Black and William are some of the most prominent researchers that have done work on formative assessment and feedback, and they said that it's all those activities undertaken by teachers or by the students which provide information to be used as feedback to modify the teaching learning activities. So you can see what I want to highlight there is it's all the activities. It's the worksheet, it's the questioning, it's the group work that you listen in on. It's the student telling you, I don't get this one. It's really anything. It's an exit card. So all of this information that's exchanged in the classroom during the learning process is feedback for the teacher, feedback for the student, and helping us figure out what we need to do next. This just illustrates that a little bit further, that you can see the student's current understanding on one side, but then there's this gap. Somehow we have to get across this gap where the student is not quite to that learning goal yet. So you as the teacher working alongside the student, you need to help negotiate some sort of bridge to get them to that learning goal or to that understanding. So feedback can happen in 3 different key ways in a classroom. The teacher gives feedback to students. So a teacher might see something that they're working on. They might give verbal feedback. A student might hand in some work. The teacher notices what they did well and what they still need to work on, writes on it. Students can give feedback to one another too. So when they're working with a peer, that relationship is a way that students can receive feedback from one another. Students can also give feedback to themselves. They can look at their own work and grade their own work or assess their own work, or this is what I think I could do to improve next time. And then students deliver feedback to the teacher. So as students give information to the teacher about how they are doing, that's information that the teacher can use to decide, I think I need to do something different tomorrow. So to dig into those a little bit more deeply, from teacher to student, feedback should be specific, relate to the specific learning task. It should be delivered as closely to the activity as possible. Otherwise, it's hard for the student to remember the process they were going through when they were doing the learning. And it should acknowledge success, not only point out the negatives. From teacher to student, this is what this slide kind of moves to like the purpose of it, because teacher to student feedback helps them construct that way forward. It's personalized to the student's needs, and it's part of interaction, and it's not always one-way communication from teacher to student. So just some tips for ways that you might give feedback to students. There are different prompts that you can use in the classroom, so I'm going to give you a few examples. One is a reminder prompt, so you might say something like, say more about how you feel about this person. So that could be feedback on a writing assignment. A scaffold prompt is where you're coming alongside them, you're helping them, you're providing a little bit of assistance that they need in order to complete a task. So a couple of examples here. Can you describe how this person is a good friend? So now you've given them something a little more specific to help them be more descriptive in their paper that they're writing, for example. Describe something that happened that showed they are a good friend. So there's another specific tip. And then an example prompt. You might give them an example that they can use as a model. So you might say, for example, you could say something similar to, he is a good friend because he shares his lunch, or she is a good friend because she is honest. Here are a few other examples of oral feedback. Imagine that this is perhaps in a PE classroom. Great dribbling today, Amir. Tomorrow you can focus on trying to move up and down the court a little faster. Jill, that was a great shot you made today. Sam, well done on defense today. In the next game, try to recover the ball when your team shifts to offense. Callie, next time just try to pass the ball a little more. Can you tell which ones are the best ones? Jill just got a positive. Callie just got a negative. But Amir and Sam got a little bit of positive and a little bit of information that can help them do even better the next time. So that was a nice combination, really constructing the way forward. So feedback can be written. This typically takes place as grading, but it could also be something where you just write on students' work. This is what you could have done better next time, and do it even without a grade. And there is a lot of research that says that when you grade a student's paper, and I bet that you all are like this too, when there's a grade on your paper, you tend to just look at the grade and not really pay much attention to the specific feedback that a teacher or instructor has given you about how you can make it better the next time. So there has been some research done where they have teachers grade students' work but not put a grade, only put feedback. And in those circumstances, students pay a lot more attention to what the teacher has written about how they can make their assignment better the next time. So I mentioned student-to-student feedback. This can occur in situations where students are working alongside one another, or when they're even giving feedback on specific assignments. But using this in your classroom raises self-esteem. It enables learners to share in the responsibility of their own learning, especially when you have students go through some sort of self-assessment process where they look at their work and they say, this is what I did well, this is what I think I can do better next time. And it prepares them for the way the real life works because we're constantly giving feedback to one another in real life. So peer assessment, it can be direct or indirect. So an example of direct peer assessment is a student grades their own work. And an example of indirect is like when students are working in a group and they're working alongside one another, it's natural that they're going to kind of talk about how the other one is doing or what they think we should do, and they're just learning from one another. And it can be formal or informal. So students could put specific marks on one another's papers, or they could just do something like talk to the person beside you about what you did for number 4. And then they learn from one another that way. So it's argued that students really learn better through interaction. So using peer assessment can be, and this is why we call it assessment for learning, not just a summative assessment of learning. By using assessment for learning and these techniques, you're getting information about what the students know and don't know, but the students are hopefully also learning through the entire process. Self-assessment, students can evaluate themselves. This helps them track their own process, and this works well after a summative test. So students can look over the problems on their summative test, and maybe they redo those problems. Maybe they write a little response as to how they think they're going to do better in the next one. Feedback also goes from student to teacher. So this is one of the most important avenues of feedback in the classroom because you get information about how students are doing. And without that, how do you know what to do, right? Like you've got to know who needs help, and you've got to know if you need to reteach something or if you're leaving students behind. Although one of the problems in the classroom is that you have to go so fast to get through everything that sometimes it's really hard not to leave people behind. But it is important to know if people need extra help. So some of the best ways you can do this is just through questioning and discussion, having a lot of dialogue with your students. You can use boards, whiteboards. You can see this student who's holding up a whiteboard in the picture there. Kids love whiteboards. So if they have their own little mini whiteboards, they can write down their response or their answers there. You have the whole class hold it up, and instantly you can see where the entire class is at. Exit cards is a wonderful strategy. Exit cards are where at the end of a lesson, even if that's, it could be the end of the day or it could just be before they go out to recess or whatever it is, you say, before you can go to recess, write down the 2 most important things that we just learned about the American Revolution. And you have them write it down on a note card. They hand it to you on their way out. And you look at it and you decide like, oh, they got it. They got the most important things, or they were not listening at all. I need to teach this in a different way. Tests are a form of feedback to the teacher. If students don't do well on it, then that's a clue that you need to do something differently. So it's so important, though, that you actually use this information, because a lot of times teachers are getting information from students, but then they're like, I don't know what to do differently, and I don't have time to do anything differently. So they just plow through, and that isn't the best practice either. So I want to talk a little bit more about what does this look like. I mentioned how you can use dialogue as a form of formative assessment in the classroom, and having quality discourse, quality conversation, quality talking, questioning is one of the best ways that you can be a quality teacher. It's hard though, but so assessment for learning, all these techniques I'm talking about work best when you have a culture in your classroom where you're involving the students in the learning process, not in a classroom where you're standing in front delivering all of the information and then expecting them to just do something in response to you. The more interactive your classroom is, the easier it is to integrate some of these formative assessment activities. So it's important for students to have opportunities to speak up, for them to communicate with their peers, for them to communicate with you. And one of the key mediums for this to happen is through questioning. And if you ever decide to go off and get a PhD, somebody needs to do their PhD. I'm sure somebody has on just questioning in the classroom, because I think it's so fascinating. So here are some examples of things that you can do to make questioning more effective in your classroom. Many teachers don't do this, but try preparing questions in advance. If you prepare the questions in advance, then you can do it in a way where you've really had time to think about what is it that I really want them to know about this topic, and what would be a good way for me to ask it so that I get the best information. Also, asking, and these questions should be more open-ended. So if you just ask, say you're teaching Charlotte's Web, do you think that Charlotte was sad when Wilbur did such and such? Students are going to go, yeah, no. But if you have an open-end question, can you explain to me how you think it felt for Charlotte in this situation? Then that's more open-ended and allows for them to elaborate more, and you get a better idea of what they understand. Encourage students to construct their own effective questions. So that's a wonderful strategy that you can use, and that leads in well to peer assessment, because you can have them come up with questions that they want to ask other people in their group. Use questions to begin discussion. So beginning any sort of classroom discussion with a big question. Like, this whole discussion is going to be for us to think about answers to this big question. Use incorrect answers for teachable opportunities. So I love this. I've seen teachers do this really well, where they might ask a question, a student answers in a particular way that could be considered not the best answer, and instead of leaving it there or saying, no, that's not really right, and correcting the student yourself, what you can do is you can say, does anybody disagree in the class? Or who disagrees? Or who agrees and who disagrees? Or would anybody else like to help or add something? And so you use it as an opportunity to bring in more of the class, and then the student is getting multiple different types of feedback in that situation. I cannot stress enough the importance of wait time. So much research shows that teachers are very and we all are, they're very afraid of the awkward silence. So what happens a lot of times in classrooms is they ask a question, and instead of giving enough wait time, especially if you have English language learners in your classroom, if you have English language learners, they really need to think and have time to formulate how they want to respond to something. But many times teachers will only wait for 2 or 3 seconds at the most before they just go ahead and answer their own question. So allow enough time for students to formulate a response. Hear from more than one. That's another strategy I really like. So you might ask a question, student responds, they have a fabulous answer. But you still don't have to stop there. Keep asking. Ask somebody else. John, what do you think about what Madeline said? Can you add anything else to that? So the more that you can involve more students, the better. Listen and respond with feedback that includes success and prompt toward further learning. So that's the example that we saw with the basketball students, is that those forms of feedback, they started out with something positive, but then they also gave them some tips on how they could do better in the next day. And when you compare those things, it's definitely optimal. And this is another really good thing to remember. When you are constructing questions, and this is part of why it's so important to construct those questions in advance, try to utilize multiple levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And we've talked about Bloom's taxonomy, but this is our progression from lower order to higher order types of thinking. If you're just asking students to name something or to list something or label something, for example, is dog a noun or adjective? And they say noun. That's not really a very complex task. So make sure that some of your questions are requiring higher forms of thinking, where they have to compare and contrast, or they have to illustrate, or they have to integrate and modify, or evaluate. And there are a couple of references for you, which of course I will upload in our Moodle shell. But that's all I have to share about assessment.